Hi folks, I hope you're all well. I just thought I'd take a moment to record a quick case study for you this week about police discretion for HSP108. Now, this is something that is pretty hard to describe overall in an online manner, so I thought I would try and step through just a little tiny example to give you a sense of how all of the key issues fit together that we've just gone through in the other main lecture about police discretion. So the case study that I've decided to focus on is looking at police discretion with Aboriginal people, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and the ways in which this leads to their overrepresentation in police contacts, obviously, and in different forms of custody. So it could be in police custody, as well as then going through the courts and becoming overrepresented in prison processes and so forth as well. So, as you know, and we've talked about this before, police had a lot of discretion with Aboriginal people in the past. There's been a lot of discussion, heated discussion, about the manner in which police interacted with Aboriginal people in the past, and most importantly, that they were essentially serving the government wishes. So the government passed down law and legislation, and the police were enacting that law and legislation based on the colonisation of Australia. And one of the things that people talk about, as we've touched on before, was the fact that there were a lot of police that took advantage of that and were, instituted quite a lot of violence against Aboriginal people. And of course, there was murders that happened and things like that. And actually, some police officers murdered Aboriginal people. So all of these issues, of course, influence what happens when we do policing now. So it's pretty important to keep those ideas in your mind that we were talking about a few weeks ago in this unit as we talk through this example. It's very clear that police had a lot of discretion with Aboriginal people in the past. The legislative frameworks that they implemented and enforced denied Aboriginal people their human rights to be part of their land and to live on their land and all of those types of things, as well as in a whole range of other ways, raising children and so forth. And of course, because the legislative frameworks denied those rights to Aboriginal people, that became part of police work, and they were effectively the ones who denied Aboriginal rights in a lot of different ways. So, and then we've also talked about how there's a lot of discretion, particularly afforded to superintendents. And this meant, superintendents and protectors, and they had differing roles depending on where they were and all of that sort of stuff. But overall, it meant that there was very limited restraint on their powers, that they could really decide to use their powers in any way they saw fit. And of course, this is what we call a form of police discretion, which we've just outlined in the other lecture. As a result of this, we've got a whole range of different outcomes that we need to take into consideration. The number one outcome, of course, is that arrest is something that's much more likely to be used by police with Aboriginal people than non-Aboriginal people in Australia. And of course, the outcome of that process is that we have much higher Indigenous arrest rates and overall a massive overrepresentation of Indigenous people in police custody. And of course, that then flows through to the prisons. And as a result, we see a lot of Aboriginal people who are dying in custody. It's quite interesting. I raised these issues in other units in the past with people, and people would say, well, I get that Aboriginal people die in custody. I understand that that's an issue and it's not appropriate for them to die, but white people die in custody too. And I just say to them, when was the last time you heard of a white person dying in custody? sometimes there's suicides, but they're extremely rare. They are really extremely rare. Aboriginal people die in custody all the time, and the media don't even talk about it. So that's the flow-on effect of the use of police discretion with Aboriginal people in their local communities. Of course, discretion also flows through in ways where the officers decide which offences will be prioritised, how police will respond in the midst of an actual or even a perceived crime will have an influence on that process, and which groups in the community police should focus attention on will also be part of that process. And of course, the other major concern is that as a result of those discretion processes, the forms of over-policing that we see sort of invoke Indigenous offending a lot of the time too. They feel as though they're being harassed by police, even though police might feel that they're doing their role appropriately and they're not, going outside the boundaries of their role and so forth. They do feel that the Aboriginal people involved feel like they're being harassed by police. And most importantly, they are thought about, they tend to think of themselves as criminals as a result of that, because police focus all of their attention on them and as suspects that are up to no good. And in all honesty, we do have a bit of research now that tells us that there are still a lot of police officers in Australia that have these thoughts about Aboriginal people as well, that they're somehow inherently criminal, as opposed to being subject to a whole range of circumstances which lead them to contact with the criminal justice system. And that is the only relationship that we can see between criminality and Aboriginal people, is that they're in circumstances that mean that they are in those positions a lot more. So, as just a little example, another example with Indigenous young people in relation to these issues, that we can see that we've got quite a lot of statistical evidence now to say that Indigenous young people, even though they make up hardly any of the population, in fact, they're probably the ones who are overrepresented in the Aboriginal population overall, because Aboriginal adults die much, much younger than we do at the moment in Australia. They still represent the minority in terms of the overall population of Australia. They're most likely to be referred to court rather than a court alternative. So instead of going to a youth justice conference, for instance, they'll be referred to court. And we know that youth justice conferencing is much more effective overall than courts are, particularly with Aboriginal young people. They're more likely to be referred to a conference rather than a caution. Now, a caution is a very simple process as opposed to a conference, which can take months and months to organise and finalise. And we know also that they're overall less likely to receive a caution. So people who are not Aboriginal in Australia are more likely to receive a caution and less likely to go to court. Aboriginal young people are more likely to go to court and less likely to receive a caution. So it's they're really significant statistics that demonstrate the fact that police discretion has a flow-on effect through every level of the criminal justice system. And I wanted to give you a brief example, talk through, a case study of that, and that specifically relates to the Northbridge policy. Now, I don't know if you've heard about the Northbridge policy. It was quite a famous policy at the time, and it was specifically focused on Aboriginal young people in Perth. Hang on a minute. No, it wasn't focused on Aboriginal young people. It ended up being focused on Aboriginal young people simply because of the ways that police discretion was being used in those contexts. So it was an after-dark curfew that applied to all young people under the age of 18 in Perth. And I'm not sure if you're aware, I should just explain that Northbridge is what they call a public adult entertainment district now, or precinct. Now, it's not adult entertainment in that there's strip clubs everywhere and all of that sort of stuff. It's just a place with restaurants, a lot of cafes, then there's a lot of nightclubs. There might well be 1 or 2 strip clubs, but it's certainly not like, a whole line of brothels or anything like that. What I mean by adult is it's an area where young people don't have access to those because they're under the age of 18. Okay, now they implemented this curfew because they felt that it was inappropriate for young people to be hanging out in these public spaces after dark. And, there's certainly compelling reasons why young people shouldn't be in those spaces after dark, particularly because of the obvious relation between violence and alcohol use, and they could be put at significant risk being in those spaces after dark with a whole bunch of violent drunk adults around. So over the 12 weeks where this curfew was implemented, nearly 450 young people were moved on by police, and over 400 of these young people were Aboriginal young people. Now, that is staggering overrepresentation of Aboriginal people, considering they make up an equally staggering small proportion of that local community. And Rayner points out quite well, I think, youth groups have anecdotes of police using their discretion to stop, question and direct young people out of the entertainment precinct who are neither underage nor misbehaving, but apparently Aboriginal. So this is something where the anecdotal evidence that they're collecting around this process has said they're actually not doing anything wrong. They're just in those public spaces. And we need to remember, although there are risks around adults being violent and all of that sort of stuff, oftentimes these spaces can be the safest places for young people, especially when home is not a safe place. So to assume that home is a safe place, it's a very significant assumption that this curfew is based upon. So the fact that they're not underage, the fact that they're not misbehaving, and that they are significant, they're obviously Aboriginal, and they're arguing that that's the reason why these people are being moved on in public places. So we can see there that police, although they're probably not outwardly racist, it's quite obvious that race is a key issue that is influencing the ways in which police discretion is being used in the context of this curfew. And there are many other curfews that have been implemented like this, some of them in specifically Aboriginal communities like Warrabinda. Now, although that seems like a really trivial thing, and why would anybody care about the lives of those young people in terms of those types of things, those young people are going to cost the system a huge and enormous amount of money. It's going to significantly reduce their life chances overall, and in fact they'll become far more entrenched in the system. They'll probably never have any work, and they probably will end up dying a good 30 or 40 years younger than everybody else as a result of being constantly caught up in this system. If they don't die as a result of various health failings, they will die as a result of suicide. So all of those things are not appropriate, and we need to ask more questions about the ways in which police discretion influences those types of processes. Anyway, that's it from me. I just thought I'd give you a little example to get you thinking about police discretion in the ways that it can be applied in everyday life, and how that can have a flow-on effect for people's lives, and most importantly, how that can then flow on into criminal justice systems. I hope that helped to explain it a bit. Have a great day, and I'll chat to you all again really soon. See ya!